Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back. As you know, we are discussing foreign aid and development. And the big question for us is, can foreign aid buy growth? Can foreign aid be a component, an element in a growth equation for a developing country? And how much of an element can it be? How much do developing countries rely on foreign aid, or to what degree does foreign aid become critical when it comes to their functioning or the various things that they need money for that they don't have the revenue to cover themselves? Now, you'll remember that one of the questions that came up last class on Monday was, why is it that donor generosity is measured in different ways? For example, why is it that generosity is measured in terms of the proportion of the country's income that goes to foreign aid, and not just in terms of the net dollar amount? And Christiana raised that question, and I got to thinking about that, and I didn't have a real good answer because, frankly, in the debate, in the discussion, sometimes these things are left unsaid. But I got to thinking and I wondered, why is it that we might think about donor generosity both in terms of the proportion of a country's income that goes to foreign aid and in terms of the net amount that it contributes? And I got to thinking, well, it could be that regional organizations or agreements between countries regarding the share or the load that one country might bear in terms of contributions of foreign aid. It seems to me that maybe in the context of agreements between advanced countries, maybe they would want to parcel out the responsibility of foreign aid between them. And then maybe it becomes relevant for them to think about the proportion of income that they spend on foreign aid. For instance, what about the European Union or the Eurozone countries? The European countries have a variety of different agreements and have harmonized much of their political and economic system. And so it stands to reason that maybe they would want to think about the proportion of individual countries' income that goes to foreign aid if they're concerned, for example, about parity or the load that individual countries might bear. Now, that being said, I think the question of which measure is more effective is still the most important question of all. You know, when we think about donor generosity, should we be thinking about the dollar amount or the proportion of a country's income spent? And what I want to start us off with today is a snapshot of US aid projects in Kenya. Now, Kenya is a landlocked African country that is very poor. Countries like Ethiopia and Kenya rely disproportionately on foreign aid because they can't generate that revenue themselves. And between 2014 2020, the spending in Kenya looked like this in a given year. $47,000 went to elephant conservation, $570,000 went to anti-corruption efforts, $399,000 went to democratic elections. Usually that goes to agencies involved in monitoring and ensuring the integrity of elections. Anti-corruption contributions typically would go to independent agencies that are set up to promote clean governance. Elephant conservation would go to conservation organizations. $160,000 went to malaria control. This was money that went to a particular foundation involved in promoting malaria control efforts in Kenya. And then $90,000 went to microfinance organizations. Now, these are basically just institutions set up to make credit available to people in Kenya, and in particular, poor people and people who might be able to generate a lot of economic activity if they have available to them credit that otherwise would not be available to them. And so in a given year, this is a representation of where that aid goes. You know, what are we actually spending this money on? And again, this is the United States Foreign Aid, the Development Agency. This is the main one in the United States, and it's the main one in the international hemisphere when it comes to national institutions that promote foreign aid. But remember that countries can also give to international institutions, and they don't necessarily need to give directly to countries. And we'll talk in a moment about what kinds of organizations are involved in mediating those relationships between countries when countries choose to give to organizations instead of directly to countries. Now, before we move on, I actually want to engage you with a question that is an important and an interesting question, and one that is a good way of getting us started thinking about what level of insight we might have already and what knowledge we might have about US federal spending. So I'm going to launch a poll, and the poll is, what share of the US federal budget is spent on foreign aid in a given year? And I want you to take a moment, think about this, and give the response that you think is closest to the truth. Now, I think that I've already given away the answer to a certain degree because we had some information on a previous slide on Monday. But I'm I'm touched by how well represented and how varied your responses are. Many of you are in the ballpark, but there's a lot of variation here. Still have 4 votes out, 3 votes out. Got a few of you out still, and give you a moment here to wrap it up. I think we have easily a quorum. 17 of 19 have voted. 2 of you are still out. I'm gonna end the voting because you got it, everyone. 9 of you, or 53% of you, said D, less than 1%, and 3 of you, or 18% of you, said 25%. 3 of you, or 18% of you, said 13%. 2 of you, or 12% of you, said 5%. Now, what's interesting about this question is, well, as I'll show you in a moment, most people have um, a, a radically incorrect idea of how much we actually spend on foreign aid. You all don't. You are on the mark for the most part. 9 of you, 53% of you said less than 1%. That is the correct answer. It's actually just a tiny fraction of the United States total income that we spend on foreign aid. And when you consider, and as we will on Friday, that spending is still mainly motivated by national security concerns, the discussion around foreign aid begins to seem quite insignificant. And sometimes when you consider these numbers, foreign aid starts to look much more like a political football. You know, it seems to be an issue that gets much more attention than maybe it merits based on how much we actually spend on foreign aid. And as I'm sure you can imagine, it's very easy to whip up and mobilize support from people who feel especially strongly about the issue by focusing on foreign aid. Why are we giving our money to Kenya, for example? This kind of rhetoric. But it's interesting to note that many of you still thought that we spend a substantially higher proportion than we actually do. And that's in line with the opinion and information polling on the American public. As you can see here, about 25% or 26% of Americans think that, oh, excuse me, hold on, let me go back. and misinterpreting my own um, figure. What this is showing us is that Americans, on the whole, think that we spend about 25% of our yearly income on foreign aid, our gross national income. So the I guess what we're interpreting this as is the largest proportion of respondents thinks that we spend about 25 or 26% of our annual budget on foreign aid. The largest proportion of respondents think that we should spend about 13% of our yearly income on foreign aid. Now, what we actually spend is less than 1%. And so look at that. Isn't that amazing? Even respondents think that we should spend more than 13 times more than what we actually do on foreign aid. And that's keeping in mind that they already think that we're spending about 25 or 26%. Very, very interesting numbers. This is quite surprising, but maybe less surprising if you think about a lot of the political rhetoric around this issue of foreign aid. It's an issue that seems to get a lot of attention from nationalists and populists and people who want to whip up anxiety and fear about foreigners and about you know the kinds of relationships that the United States has with other countries. Now, again, we're talking about the U.S. context because the United States gives the most foreign aid, and as I'll show you in a moment when we discuss the history of aid, foreign aid as an institution and as a practice is actually a product of U.S. actions in the post-war period that were associated with the Marshall Plan. And so foreign aid as a practice in the first place we have to understand it in the US context. Do these numbers surprise anyone, or does this seem about right to you?
I don't think it's too surprising. I think one way we could look at is when they were passing the recent COVID relief bill, and it was a huge deal about how much money we were spending on foreign aid. When in reality, it's really not too much of our GDP that we were really discussing in that bill. Um, but everybody thought we were spending loads of money on foreign aid to other countries.
Yeah.
It's passing.
Yeah, and what's striking, Max, is that even the amount that we spend, and as I'll illustrate on Friday, that money is spent mainly because of national security concerns, right? So, like, let's not kid ourselves. Foreign aid is really just support and transfers designed to promote national interests. Sure, there's concern about human rights and democracy, but usually only when human rights and democracy work in favor of the United States, right? Very selective. This is foreign policy. It's foreign aid, but it's really foreign policy. And so not only is the actual amount spent on foreign aid minuscule, but I'm not persuaded that foreign aid itself is actually detrimental to the promotion of US interests if truly it's primarily motivated by concern about leveraging US influence and establishing and maintaining relationships that are favorable and beneficial for the United States. See what action we have here in the chat. Karen says it seems about right. Rady says by looking at education and healthcare spending, 1% of the national budget, I would assume we spend even less in foreign aid. Yeah, and when we think about the budgetary and the fiscal priorities of the U.S. government, it makes it difficult to spend much on anything else when 50% of discretionary spending is on defense, and when 18% of the budget is spent on the military. It's difficult to prioritize other things, even rhetorically, let alone economically, based on the numbers themselves. And then when you consider that much of or at least a lot of the spending in defense is eventually goes down the drain because of waste and opportunism, well then the amount that we spend on foreign aid is minuscule indeed. And so the priorities, and Rady says, plus we keep adding to the national debt. Yeah, but keep in mind that the growth or the rate of the growth of the national debt is probably what matters more. Deficits have not continually increased in size, even if we run a deficit of 2 or 3% in a given year, which is quite ordinary. That will mean that overall the debt will continue to increase. What we should be more concerned about is the rate of growth of the deficit and then corresponding increases in the rate of growth of the debt. So accounting for, some of this normal change, I actually think that the debt is less of a concern than it's often made up to be. Much like foreign aid, debt is kind of like a political football, not well understood, but very useful rhetorically for those who wish to argue against more spending. Walter says, does the US population give more than the government to foreign aid? No, no. Foreign aid is typically, and as we saw on Monday, it's defined as a transfer, uh, well, by one country to another, but ordinarily we define it that way because of what we refer to as official development assistance, and that's assistance that comes from one government to another. So, yes, foreign aid is understood mainly as aid provided by a government. Uh, but individuals do give, and private actors do give too. So I'm sure you all, know about like Tom's shoes, for example. Buy a pair and they give one to a child in need or something. That's kind of an example of private giving. Although, as a side note, should be noted that that's actually a terribly detrimental practice because it undercuts local domestic capital formation, and it makes it very difficult for shoemakers in poor countries to actually develop a market share when American companies are just giving people free shoes. That one was never really thought entirely through. If the objective was to develop these places, well, taking market share by giving away free shoes isn't necessarily the best way to do that. But I digress. Let's continue addressing the key issues. So Walter asked a good question, which is, do we include private or individual giving? And what do we mean technically by foreign assistance? And what we mean is really spending by the US government and by governments. And that's what we're discussing here. And the objectives are ordinarily poverty alleviation or economic growth or some specific outcome, some development outcome. But remember that a lot of foreign aid is only a fraction devoted to concessional loans or development priorities. In fact, foreign aid can be defined as foreign aid when as little as 25% of it is categorized as a concessional loan or some sort of grant. And so when we say poverty alleviation and economic growth, there's often quite a bit else packaged in with the transfers themselves. But these are transfers by the US government. And technically, not only is it called official development assistance, but it also falls under Function 150 or the 150 account, as it's called. And there are a number of sub accounts and numbers associated with these sorts of transfers. And generally speaking, as we've established, Americans tend to radically overestimate how much we actually spend on foreign aid. And I'm showing you here from 2013 the composition of the US federal budget. Today it's similar, although I think defense is even larger. Less than 1% goes to international affairs, under which foreign aid would fall. And foreign aid is even a smaller category within international affairs. And so it's really quite marginal. Even when the United States gives as a net a larger total than any other country and by a large margin, it's still actually a fraction of the overall gross national income generated by the country in a given year. And I don't know what that testifies to. Does that suggest that the US economy is just gigantic? Or does it suggest that countries on the whole are just not giving that much in foreign aid? I don't know. I think it's a matter of interpretation, right? I can say, in my personal opinion, that when you look at that snapshot of the Kenya giving, doesn't seem particularly generous. Like a few $100,000 for mosquito control, a few $100,000 for election integrity here and there. Considering that the U.S. government's federal income is so substantial and that they can actually finance much of what they want by selling bonds or obtaining loans, uh, doesn't strike me as a as particularly outlandish. But again, I think that when you look at the relative numbers, well, then it becomes interesting to look at who's giving the most and why, and maybe who gets the most and why. So, for instance, um, a lot of the foreign aid can complement political objectives, and so sometimes foreign aid flows in large volumes to places that are ruled by brutal regimes, but that alternative is more palatable than communism or some you know alternative that the US government might not be favorable of. And so I'm thinking about the Cold War, for example, when many unsavory regimes were funded and financed by military aid and foreign aid, despite the brutality of many of them. Although we should be fair too and add that, in some cases, the US government did deny and withdraw funding and even imposed sanctions on certain countries like Chile when it became clear that the repression of the regime was intolerable. But on this issue of the trends and the patterns in spending, let's take a look at a visualization that will put this in perspective for us and show us the changes over time. Bring up a new share here. So you should be seeing a USAID data set, and pay close attention because I'm going to press play and we can watch the visualization over the course of, I think, something like 75 years or something. It shows you where US foreign aid is going. And it also shows you where it's coming from, and or that is what proportion of US foreign aid is categorized as defense aid or agricultural or related to the Peace Corps or so on and so forth. And you can see that over time, where the foreign aid is concentrated tends to change. And whereas in the post World War II period, it was primarily concentrated in Europe, Western Europe especially, in the more recent decades, it's concentrated in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. And so that's significant because it corresponds with the evolution of the national security interests of the United States. And as we'll talk about on Friday, then we can understand a lot of these patterns by thinking about where conflict was concentrated and where it was taking place, and in the balance of power between, say, US and in other interests at the given time. And so during the Cold War, the 60s and the 70s especially, it became essential for the US government to finance Latin American countries and support regimes that were hostile to communism, or at least viewed that way, and viewed as a bulwark against the expansion of the Soviet Union. And so my point is not to to argue that foreign aid has no potential benefit. It's to be realistic about foreign aid and the motivations, and it's to show you and suggest that we can best understand foreign aid by thinking about the interests and the ideas and the relationships of the giving country. And in the case of the United States, well, that has a lot to do with conflict and war and the relationships between the United States and European countries, then Latin American countries, and the Middle Eastern countries, and so on. So when we look at this, do you have any comments or do you have any questions about this data? Is anything about this especially interesting to you? I'm going to stop the share and we're going to continue with the lecture and continue addressing these questions about foreign aid and development, and in particular, the origin of the practice of giving foreign aid, the ways that states give foreign aid. I said earlier that states often give foreign aid directly, but they just as often give aid to international organizations that then distribute the aid to developing countries on their behalf. And so these include like the United Nations Development Program, the World Health Organization is one example, the Inter-American Development Bank is one in the Americas, the World Food Program, the African Development Bank, the World Bank. These are all examples of international aid organizations that serve to connect states, and in particular to channel foreign aid from advanced countries to developing countries. And as I'm sure you could imagine, there's a regionalization of the efforts. And so the Inter-American Development Bank is heavily involved in the Americas, and especially in the Northern Triangle and Mexico. The African Development Bank is heavily involved in sub-Saharan Africa and the poorest parts of Africa. The UN is involved throughout Africa, both in terms of distributing foreign aid, but also performing peacekeeping operations. The World Bank is involved in providing credit and loans to developing countries, often in moments of economic crisis when they need help with balance of payments issues. In a lot of these cases, the money doesn't come without strings attached. And so we should be very clear. The World Bank, for instance, does use the principle of conditionality. And conditionality, as you'll recall, has to do with establishing conditions that have to be met, criteria that have to be satisfied by the recipient in order for them to receive the money, or to remain in good standing and eligible to receive money again, or to receive the second or the third or whatever tranche of the loan itself. So the World Bank, for instance, is generally quite strict in terms of the conditions, and economic adjustment and austerity is often associated with foreign aid that is obtained through the World Bank. But it need not be the case that strings are attached. Sometimes the aid is given from country to country, and it doesn't come with conditions, but the details are often left up to the countries themselves. And this has as much to do with relationships between countries as anything else, because one thing that's different about the international sphere is that it's anarchic. There is no world government to impose order on negotiating countries, and so oftentimes there are conditions attached, and maybe just as often there aren't. And so, for instance, North Korea relies a lot on foreign aid, but they don't necessarily meet conditions to continue to receive that foreign aid. They're getting that foreign aid instead from countries who identify North Korea as essential or important to their own national interests. So China gives money to North Korea, Russia gives money to North Korea. Other countries do that I can't name right now. Maybe Venezuela, but my point is that there's a lot of complexity and variation, and who you're getting the money from and under what circumstances will affect the rules or the criteria that recipient countries have to satisfy. There are also non-governmental organizations like the Carter Center, Mercy Corps, Catholic Relief Services that states give to as well, and that assist developing countries. And so a lot of these have a mission of their own, promoting peace, promoting reconciliation, restoring democratic elections, promoting social consensus after conflict or crisis. You name it. A lot of religious organizations and churches are involved in giving to developing countries. Um, for instance, when I was growing up, I knew a lot of kids and friends who would go on mission trips to Latin American countries with their church, and they would do mission work. And a lot of the organizations or the churches that they worked with would get funding from NGOs who themselves got funding from national governments. And so there's a complex set of relationships between NGOs and states. And the key point that I want you to remember is that there are always economic and political interests. It's it's the case that there is no such thing as a free lunch, politically speaking. Foreign aid comes with strings attached, be they economic or political or social, whatever it is. The sender, in most cases, virtually always, wants something in return or has some expectation. And so, as a result, in political science, there's been a very lively debate about the the moral kind of elements of foreign aid. And for example, there's been a discussion about the right of countries to say no to foreign aid, or to reject an offer of foreign aid based upon the idea that it so often comes with strings attached that it can undermine the sovereignty and the interests of that country, when it frankly isn't worth it. But these are issues that come into consideration when we talk about the political economy of foreign aid in particular, and we'll deal with that on Friday. Um, but as we begin to think more and more about interests and motivations in the real powers that be when it comes to foreign aid, I want you to start to think about some of the contrasting perspectives and views on foreign aid. Really, there are two big views in the debate. On the left is represented this cynical view of foreign aid that views foreign aid as fundamentally um, flawed because it's motivated by ulterior motives and the cynical interests of the sender. In the case of the United States, that's their national security imperatives or their economic interests, and so on and so forth. Um, this view sees foreign aid as malign and malicious and intended to support the establishment of some relationship of dependence or control that benefits the sending country primarily at the expense of the recipient. But there's a radically different view that stands in stark contrast to this skeptical, cynical view represented on the left. And this other view is on the right here. And this is the optimistic, positive view. This is the view that foreign aid is ultimately a force for good, and that the sending countries don't have malign intent or ulterior motives. They, in fact, are primarily concerned about things like eliminating smallpox or reducing poverty, promoting world health, so on and so forth. And scattered in between are some views that are more nuanced, that kind of fall along both dimensions to some degree, but don't necessarily come down so hard on one side or the other. And I'm curious, what your view is, and maybe I'm curious in particular what view you came into this lecture with on Monday. Did you have a strong opinion about foreign aid? Did you have a skeptical or cynical opinion about foreign aid? Did you have an optimistic or a positive or a favorable view? Did you think that it was a force for evil or a force for good? Does anyone have an opinion, or did anyone have an opinion coming into this lecture?
Well, I think that foreign aid is always a good thing. I mean, as you mentioned earlier, is that it extends U.S. influence, right? And we have the opposite happening right now, in which China's starting to put a lot into their own foreign aid projects, and they're becoming very influential around the world. You know, uh, America, Trump wanted it to become number one again, but I think that we're losing our number one stance globally in terms of foreign aid and influence.
So, Max, it sounds like from your point of view, it's possible to distribute foreign aid and promote development while simultaneously promoting your own power or influence on the international stage. They don't have to be mutually exclusive. Like, get out there and give. In other words, it sounds like that's Max's point of view, and that's an admirable position. That's the position of Jeffrey Sachs, who's this renowned economist who says that global poverty is the single biggest challenge to development, but it's also the single biggest manageable problem because we have the money and the resources and the income to give and to use foreign aid as an instrument to reduce poverty. And so I think that's consistent enough with Max's point of view. And I think that's the point of view that many people take, and why not, right? Go ahead and give. Sure, it's okay to have some strings attached, but we don't want to get out punched by anyone else, right? Victor has says I usually had a positive view on aid. Yeah, me too, for the most part. Rady says I believe foreign aid can also be problematic for a country because its population may start showing discontent based on the government actions of sending foreign aid while the country sinks in poverty. So Rady highlights that, look, foreign aid isn't a magic bullet, right? Don't you need investments in productive infrastructure that can pay for themselves over the long term and that can contribute to development in a more sustained and substantial way? And I'm going to show you in a moment that it's possible that foreign aid can help to contribute to that eventual outcome, and that maybe foreign aid alone isn't the answer, but that it's part of a solution. So we'll see that in Europe, foreign aid was essential, but maybe it wasn't, because there's actually a difficult time figuring out exactly what was doing the work. And what I mean is recovery is complicated, and foreign aid might be a component. But if Rady is correct, conditionality in the form of austerity might undercut the objective of foreign aid. And so this is actually where we start to think critically and analytically about what circumstances and what conditions would be most productive or useful for foreign aid. Ernie says, I always thought foreign aid was very simple, but coming into these last two lectures, I've realized it's a bit more complex. But I do know that foreign aid is a good thing overall because it's meant for good and to help underdeveloped countries. At times, though, sometimes those underdeveloped countries take advantage of foreign aid and make situations worse in their respective countries. So corruption can be a serious challenge, and corruption can contribute to a waste of resources and a waste of time and money and talent and energy. And sometimes foreign aid can be embezzled or can be can be stolen by leaders, and that certainly is a problem, right? But I think that more often than not, it can be for a force for good, as long as, well, as long as I think the freedom to say no remains a freedom, right? You know what I mean? It has to be a choice and not something else. Christiana says, I feel like foreign aid in itself is good. However, sometimes it is not always effective. Yeah. So how do we measure the effectiveness of foreign aid? And are we better off not giving it if we know ahead of time that the framework for the distribution of that foreign aid is inappropriate or ineffective? We'll talk about that as well on Friday. Let's move to the history of. Oh, first, actually, let me actually say a little bit more about these contrasting views. So, as I established, one of the main disagreements is about the motivations of those who give foreign aid and about whether those motivations are cynical or altruistic. Some say that aid is a form of bribery. You're essentially, bribing countries into either submission or compliance or some relationship that they don't necessarily want, but that you're purchasing with this transfer. Some say that aid is a form of support for allies who can essentially do anything and still receive the aid. Well, there's some evidence that this is what it is as well. Some see that motives as much more altruistic, however, and they see that aid is genuine, it's designed to help the poor. These are different viewpoints, different attitudes about aid and what aid is fundamentally. And then to Christiana's point, there's disagreement about the effectiveness of aid. And the fundamental question, as a reminder, is can foreign aid buy growth?
I actually have like another like point is like I feel like aid in itself is good, but I feel like the policy behind it is what could make it corrupt.
So you think then that aid is important, but it has to be distributed in like a way that is clean and that is transparent and that is free from um, corruption or patrimonialism or favoritism or personalism.
Yeah. And also, aid could help build foreign relations with other countries, which I think is also useful.
Yeah, definitely. And a lot of what we talked about in this class is developing countries, they industrialize and depend a lot, virtually always, on the international economy, right? Because they're exporting primary products and commodities, they're seeking to industrialize and often acquiring loans and credit from foreign banks. They are relying a lot on the global market because, well, unless they're lucky, they might not have a large internal domestic market. So they need to build these foreign relationships and partnerships. And the United States is a large market, right? Represents the potential to consume a lot of the products produced by a developing country. And so developing a relationship with the United States can be quite useful if you're producing primary products or commodities or things that the United States might import from your country in large numbers. And so maybe you're willing to take the aid under some conditions. Maybe there are a variety of different considerations. And yeah, and this goes to questions about whether aid is fundamentally effective or not. And one viewpoint is that aid can promote growth and it can reduce poverty in those really, really poor countries, in your Kenyas, your Ethiopias. Something's got to move the needle, right? And in an economic sense, if the United States gives enough, even if it's a tiny share of its total income, you can promote growth and maybe you can reduce poverty. Maybe if you give enough over time in enough places, you can help to bring about that outcome. Even if there are some political considerations or some interests that you're satisfying in giving that money, they may not be mutually exclusive. And even if we're realistic and a realist about this, it's possible that foreign aid might still have some potential benefit, and I think it certainly can, without a doubt. But I agree though with Christiana that the way that it is distributed and the transparency of the giving and the transfer matters a lot. So if you give a huge transfer to Mobutu in the Congo, well, good luck, right? He's probably going to put that in his piggy bank, which was already the public coffers anyway. So in that situation, foreign aid would almost certainly be stolen. And this is the second view, which is that look, aid is wasted on corrupt regimes and it creates dependency. There are powers that be that are in a position to take this money, and these countries, even if they use it wisely or productively or not, they become dependent on it in the absence of their own, their own comparative advantages or their own initiative. These are different views, and the debate is not settled by any stretch. Where you stand depends on where you sit, and there are very, very strong opinions on both sides. And foreign aid is often highly politicized for this reason. And sometimes, as we've already seen, it's tough to accurately inform people about how much it's being spent, where it's going, and what it compares to in terms of the budgetary priorities of the U.S. government. So the question, where does aid come from, is sort of the next question for us. And well, since we've presented a context that's highly dominated by the US experience, you wouldn't be surprised that foreign aid was really a US invention, or at least it became an instrument of US foreign policy before it became a common practice. And really, it was a decision and an initiative of two individuals. Well, first, George Marshall, who was a British politician in the post World War II period, and then President Harry Truman, who was also a politician during this World War II, post World War II period, but in the United States. And both the Brits and the US Americans recognized at that moment that Western Europe was in really desperate straits. They faced shortages of food, basic goods. They weren't able to feed themselves or jumpstart economic or industrial recovery. They really were doing without a paddle, so to speak. And it was a difficult situation, especially because the Soviet Union was recovering very, very rapidly. And the contrast between Western Europe and communist Russia couldn't be starker at this time. And there was a very real fear that a new depression and resulting political and economic instability would grow if someone didn't step in and mobilize and transfer a huge amount of income to these Western European countries that were so desperately in need of economic and industrial recovery. And in particular, the US administration and the Brits were concerned that Western Europe wasn't strong enough vis-a-vis communism, and that they didn't represent an effective bulwark against the expansion of communism under their present circumstance. And so they decided to begin to channel foreign aid directly to Western European countries. And this was called the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan was designed first and foremost to shore up Western European countries, to provide them the food and the goods that they needed, to provide them the capital inputs that they needed to recover and to provide an effective bulwark against communism. This has to be understood in the context of US interests and the global struggle for power in the post World War II period. And on Friday, we'll continue to discuss that. Today, we're out of time, but thanks for being here, everybody. We'll continue on Friday, and I'll see you then.